National mobilization. You know what that means in our vocabulary? That means the draft. That means bringing back the draft. That means signing you and or your kids up to fight for them, whether you or your kids want to fight or not. The 118th Congress, in an election year, is openly discussing bringing back the draft, which you don't know because the room was empty. And the so-called reporters in D.C. are too busy covering every dumb fucking thing that is said in the presidential campaign.
I am so damn tired of being lied to. I don't think I can deny it anymore. You can stick to your story if you think it but I'm not gonna buy it anymore.
Hello, my friend, and thank you for listening to the 298th episode of the listener-supported podcast, Congressional Dish. I'm your host, Jennifer Briney. And today's episode is going to be about a conversation that is happening in your Congress right now, which you're probably not aware of, because I haven't seen this covered anywhere in the news, and there was damn near no one sitting in the hearing room. You know, this reminds me of an episode that we did, I want to say it was the beginning of 2015, where there was a hearing where the witnesses were Madeleine Albright, George Shultz, and Henry Kissinger. Very powerful people, even when they were out of power. And in that hearing, the stuff that they talked about, it was almost like we were looking into a crystal ball. Very specifically, I remember George Shultz talking about drone swarms, which 10 years later are a very real thing. These are teeny tiny drones that you can stick into a shipping container, put guns on them, and then they swarm locations and kill people. And those are real things now. And so when I see hearings like that, I pay attention to them. And I think this was one of those hearings. This is a hearing that took place in the Senate Armed Services Committee on July 30th. And the witnesses, you might not recognize these names right away, but one of them I definitely recognize. The witnesses were Eric Edelman and Jane Harman. And the reason that they were testifying to the Senate is that they were co-chairs on the Commission on the National Defense Strategy, which was created by Congress in the 2022 National Defense Authorization Act in order to judge the 2022 National Defense Strategy. Basically, they were looking at our warfighting plans and telling Congress how they need to be updated for our current times. And these two witnesses in particular really set off my radar, but there was one in particular, and that's Jane Harman. Jane Harman was a member of the House of Representatives from 1993 to 1999, and again from 2001 to 2011. She was in there for like 2 decades. And Jane Harman was the congresswoman in the district next to mine when I lived in Los Angeles, as Congress was approving endless wars and sending people that I love to fight and to die in an unnecessary war in Iraq, which are 2 tragedies that she voted in favor of. And it wasn't just the proximity of her district to mine, which was literally only a few blocks away, that put Jane Harman on my radar. But she was on my radar because her district was full of war manufacturers. All you had to do was drive down Sepulveda Boulevard into her district, and you'd see all of them. Boeing, Raytheon, Northrop Grumman, they're all headquartered in her district, and she clearly considered them to be her true constituents when I watched her serve on all of the committees that were supposed to be doing oversight. She was on the House Armed Services Committee, she was on the Intelligence Committee, and she was on the Committee on Homeland Security. And she took a lot of money from the people in those companies. Now, this doesn't include any of the contributions that she took from her time in Congress in the early 1990s. And so these are low estimates. But she took at least $212,000 from people affiliated with her highest contributing group, Northrop Grumman alone. She also took over $100,000 from people affiliated with her 4th highest contributing group, which was people affiliated with Boeing. In total, she took at least $834,000 from people in the defense industry. But she also took over $1 million from people in the lobbyist category, and we have no way to know what they were lobbying her for. And so the point I'm trying to make here is that this woman has been on my radar for over 20 years, and she has always been a servant to war profiteers. And so when I saw that she was the top Democrat writing this report, I knew I had to watch it right away. And then there's Eric Edelman. Now, to be honest with you, Eric Edelman wasn't really on my radar before this hearing, but he was the Republican co-chair of the commission that created this report telling our Congress what they should do about all the wars we're about to get into. And this guy's resume sucks too. The part of his resume that makes me say that is the part where he served as the principal deputy assistant to the vice president for national security affairs from February 2001 through July 2003, which means that he was advising Dick Cheney on national security affairs during 9/11, one of the biggest security failures in American history, and he guided Vice President Dick Cheney through his efforts to lie to the world and invade Iraq for no good reason. And after those epic failures on the job, he was promoted to Undersecretary of Defense for Policy from 2005 to 2009. In other words, he's one of the geniuses who made war policy for the George W. Bush administration during 9/11 and the Iraq War. Now, in a sane country, this man would be banished from all war policy discussions until the end of time. But in this country, he's the Republican co-chair of a commission that is telling this Congress how to govern in matters of war. Eric Edelman and Jane Harman, a bipartisan chairmanship of a commission that was requested by Congress to give their advice in matters of war, have created a report, and the report is done. And so today, you're going to listen in on the conversation that these two warmongers had with our Congress about our future in war. And I will warn you that this episode is bleak. This conversation was deeply disturbing to me. And one of the things that you're not going to hear me do very much in this episode is tell you which senator is a Democrat and which one is a Republican, because one of the most disturbing things to me was that there was no sunlight in between their positions. They were all just asking polite questions as if all of this is just the natural order of things. When it comes to matters of war, right now, what I'm witnessing is that the Democrats and Republicans might as well be the same party. And so I'm not going to waste any of your time differentiating between the two. Because like I said, Jane Harman is a Democrat and Eric Edelman is a Republican, and they wrote this report together. But I want you to hear this conversation because it could have a direct effect on our lives. And so to get us started, here's Jane Harman with the big picture summary of our situation as they see it.
The threats to U.S. national security and our interests are greater than any time since World War II and more complex than any threats during the Cold War.
And to start breaking down that ominous conclusion, here's Dick Cheney's buddy, Eric Edelman, highlighting one of our three main threats. And in this clip, he's going to refer to the NDS, which stands for National Defense Strategy.
The 2022 NDS identified China as the pacing challenge. We found that China is in many ways outpacing the U.S. While we still have the strongest military in the world with the farthest global reach, when we get to 1,000 miles of China's shore, we start to lose our military dominance and could find ourselves on the losing end of a conflict. China's cyber capabilities, space assets, growing strategic forces, and fully modernized conventional forces are designed to keep us from engaging in the Taiwan Strait or the South or East China Seas. China has been testified to before Congress, has infiltrated our critical infrastructure networks to prevent or deter U.S. action by contesting our logistics, disrupting American power and water, and otherwise removing the sanctuary of the homeland that we have long enjoyed.
Did you find it strange that these people consider it a problem that China has some operational control in their own neighborhood? Why do they expect to have military dominance within 1,000 miles of China's shores as if that's the natural order of things? Now, my running theory here on Congressional Dish, which almost 13 years of obsessive research has led me to, and which I still believe to be true, is that in the world, the United States currently functions as the muscle for what I nickname the World Trade System, because I don't know what else to call it. But it's a global financial system that was created after World War II, and which those in charge of it, the same people who currently control our government, well, they believe that they should be in control of this one global financial system. And as the muscle for the system, it is the duty of our military to make sure that multinational corporations have unfettered access, as much as possible, to the world's resources, human labor, and our military makes sure that no locals can attack those corporations when they pillage their land and remove their riches from those countries. And so in China's neighborhood, in the Taiwan Strait and the seas off of China's coast, the reason our military is supposed to have control is to safeguard the shipping lanes for the corporations that our government currently serves, and to protect Taiwan, which is governed by the losers of China's civil war and which has dedicated itself to the World Trade System to an extent that China refuses to do. Taiwan, as a part of the World Trade System, is home to the most important semiconductor manufacturers in the world. And until we can build semiconductor plants of our own, which the CHIPS Act, you might remember my episode about this, but the CHIPS Act a few years ago dedicated many billions of your tax dollars to build new semiconductor plants here in America, with no profit share for us taxpayers required. But until those plants outside of Taiwan are finished, because semiconductors are essential parts of most technologies, this means that they think they need to protect Taiwan from officially becoming a part of China again, because that would give China the opportunity to cut the World Trade System off from semiconductors, making many products for World Trade System corporations impossible to create and profit from. Viewed from that perspective, what Eric Edelman just said makes perfect sense. Because while we Americans are largely unaware of our military's true purpose in the world right now, which is to essentially make the world safe for corporate plunder, in the empty hearing rooms in Washington, D.C., where the most important conversations in our country take place, conversations like this one, they speak about our purpose quite openly, albeit with different vocabulary than I use. And as we listen to their conversation today, we need to be mindful of their worldview, regardless of if we support it. Because for many of us, the idea that the United States has to have military dominance over every inch of the planet, well, for many of us, that sounds expensive, dangerous, and absurd. As the muscle for the enforcement of the World Trade System and therefore the protectors of the shareholder class, a class that these people belong to, the class of rich people who get to collect unearned wealth from corporate shares, for them, our military dominance over every inch of the planet makes perfect sense. Because that is what is necessary to ensure that the World Trade System of global corporate exploitation remains dominant. And it has to be enforced at the barrel of our guns, because there are a lot of countries that are not participating willingly in that system anymore. Countries like China and Russia, which is the second boogeyman identified in the hearing. Here's Eric Edelman.
For its part, Russia has reconstituted its own defense industrial base after its invasion of Ukraine much more rapidly than people anticipated. Vladimir Putin seeks to reassert Russia as a great power and is happy to destabilize the world in order to do so.
Destabilize the world or the world order that they control. As we've heard in so many episodes and so many hearings in the past, China and Russia, those are the big two boogeymen right now. And then there's everyone else. Here's Eric Edelman again, and in this clip, you're going to hear him refer to the DNI, which is the Director of National Intelligence.
Our report describes the threats posed by Iran, North Korea, and terrorism as well. Clearly, Iran and North Korea both feel emboldened by the current environment, and terrorism remains a potent threat fueled by the proliferation of technology. As the DNI has said, the current war in the Middle East is likely to have a generational impact on terrorism.
Terrorism, the use of violence to achieve a political end. And the word terrorism always seems to be applied by these people when violence is used by those who don't have military might. Terrorists use homemade bombs, and they are bad. They are so very evil. But moral armies and militaries use 2,000-pound bombs against people who don't have a military, and that is moral and right. An act of violence is labeled either terrorism or resistance based purely on whose side you're on. But the main point he is making is correct. Because in the Middle East, the ongoing Israeli effort to erase Gaza and the West Bank, collectively Palestine, from the map, well, in Gaza, the relentless bombing of a caged population, the forced starvation, the refusal to allow them access to clean water or medicine, the proven torture of Palestinian prisoners, And the Biden administration's decisions to make us all complicit in all of it by continuing to send tens of billions of our dollars worth of weapons to Israel, yes, this will have a generational impact on what they call terrorism, also referred to as resistance, by those who don't have drones and quadcopters and fighter jets and naval ships that they can use to fight back with. There is a generation, in fact, there are multiple generations, that are experiencing horror beyond anything I could have imagined us being involved in, and that hate us for our participation in it. And instead of considering for even 1 second in this hearing that we lessen some of that hate by using our enormous leverage over Israel to stop the elimination of Palestine bit by bit, bomb by bomb, instead they label the victims as future terrorists. But most of the world doesn't view the babies of Gaza as future terrorists. And there are countries around the world that are now uniting to counter those that they consider the bad guys, to counter us. And those countries have labeled themselves the axis of resistance. But in a sneak peek of the propaganda to come, here's Senator Roger Wicker of Mississippi.
The document details the way in which the 2022 National Defense Strategy and assessment completed just 2 years ago did not adequately account for the threat of simultaneous and increasingly coordinated military action by our four primary adversaries, a group which I have come to call the axis of aggressors.
Well, regardless of what nickname is attributed to the countries that are aligning against us, the alignment is real. It is happening. Here's Jane Harmon.
I remember being a member of the Defense Policy Board when Jim Mattis was Secretary of Defense, and his piece of advice to us was, let's do everything we can to keep Russia and China apart. Well, oops, that has not happened. And there is this close friendship and collaboration between them. You asked, how is it manifested? Well, we see it most at the moment in Ukraine, where Russia was the aggressor, violating international law and invading Ukraine, and China is a huge help to Russia in evading our sanctions by buying Russian gas and by its efforts to ship into China material for the war. And then you add in, as you mentioned, Iran and North Korea, which are suppliers of drones and other lethal material to Russia. And this unholy alliance, or whatever I think you call it, alliance of aggression, is extremely dangerous. Let's remember that both North Korea has nuclear weapons, Iran is at breakout for nuclear weapons, and the other two countries are nuclear countries. And where this goes is, it seems to me, terrifying. And that is, again, why we need to leverage all elements of national power to make sure we deter these countries from acting against us.
But as usual, the conversation veered beyond simply defending the United States, stopping others from acting against us. Here's Eric Edelman's explanation of the big game.
Ukraine offered to give up, and I was involved in some of the diplomacy of this back in the 90s, the nuclear weapons that were left on its territory after the end of the Soviet Union. As a result of that, Ukraine gave them up, but in exchange for assurances from the United States, Russia, Great Britain, and France that its territorial integrity would be recognized along the border lines that existed before the 2014 seizure of Crimea by Putin, which was a violation of those undertakings. If our assurances in the nonproliferation realm, in this instance, are shown to be hollow, it will raise questions in the minds of all of our allies about the assurances we've given them, our extended deterrent assurances, whether it's for our allies in Europe, part of our multilateral NATO alliance, or our bilateral allies in East Asia, or our partners, parts of special relationships we've developed in the Middle East with Israel, the Kingdom of Saudi Arabia, the UAE, and Egypt and others. So the whole fabric, frankly, of the international order is at risk here depending on the outcome in Ukraine. And to your point, if Putin is successful in Ukraine, the lesson that Xi Jinping is likely to draw is that he too can be successful in Taiwan or in the East China Sea or the South China Sea.
It's always about their international order. That's the vocabulary they use to describe their military and financial dominance over the entire world. And they know that for many reasons, not the least of which is their hypocrisy and physical support of clearly immoral uses of violence in our names. But they know that their international order, their dominance over the world, is being challenged. And here's where shit gets scary. Here's Eric Edelman.
There is potential for near-term war and a potential that we might lose such a conflict. The partnership that's emerged among China, Russia, Iran, and North Korea is a major strategic shift that we have not completely accounted for in our defense planning. It makes each of those countries potentially stronger militarily, economically, and diplomatically, and potentially can weaken the tools we have at our disposal to deal with them. And it makes it more likely that a future conflict, for instance, in the Indo-Pacific, would expand across other theaters and that we would find ourselves in a global war that is on the scale of the Second World War.
And if that happens, here's Senator Tom Cotton of Arkansas, who is also an unrepentant warmonger, questioning Cheney's friend, Eric Edelman.
Ambassador Edelman, you spoke with Senator Fisher about the multiple theater force construct, basically the kind of threats we're planning for. And there's a time when this nation planned to fight two major wars at a time. And I think now we're down to a force that can fight one conflict and protect our homeland and hopefully scare bad guys everywhere else around the world and not starting a war. Is that right?
That is correct. That's what the 2022 NDS describes.
So that's what our National Defense Strategy says. Is the current force even capable of doing that, in your opinion? Putting aside what it should be capable of doing, which I'll come to momentarily, can it even do that?
I think there are very serious questions about whether the force in being could actually execute the strategy.
Okay.
So this guy who just spent a couple years studying it thinks that we can't fight one war and protect our actual country. And yet we know that right now we are in the middle of the Russia-Ukraine war. We know we are in the middle of Israel's destruction of Gaza and all of the anger in the Middle East that is generating. And they keep talking about an upcoming war with China. But right now, we know we are already in the middle of proxy wars in 2 out of those 3 theaters. And we're being told that we can't even handle one of them if we were to get actually involved. And our unpreparedness to fight any kind of wars, apparently, is multifaceted. Because first, we don't have what we need to fight a physical world war. Here's Eric Edelman.
President Putin, in some ways, has done us a bit of a favor by having invaded Ukraine and exposed, as a result, some of the limitations of U.S. defense industrial production, and shown that it's grossly inadequate to provide the equipment, technology, and munitions that the U.S. military and our allies and partners need today, let alone given the demands of a potential future conflict, which might be even more taxing.
So we don't have enough weapons, and we don't have the capacity to make what we would need to fight a world war. But also, the world has changed since World War II, because there are ways that other countries can hurt us here at home without firing a single shot. Here's Eric Edelman.
Homeland, if there's a conflict, is not going to be a sanctuary anymore. And the first attacks will likely be in the cyber domain, and they will be incredibly disabling for our society, but also for the department. But getting all of the agencies of government that would have a role in all this, because it goes beyond just DOD, it goes beyond just DHS. I mean, it goes to the Department of Transportation, it goes to Commerce. I mean, it's an unbelievably complex issue, and we're only, I think, now kind of wrapping our minds around it, and it needs a lot more work and attention from the department.
And Jane Harman, the Congresswoman of the defense industry, expanded on that in a conversation with Senator Mike Rounds of South Dakota.
On cyber, it's a huge threat, and I don't think we minimize it in any way. One of the things we might anticipate, for example, is if China decides to annex Taiwan or whatever euphemism they might use, they might engage in a major cyber attack here first, for which we are underprepared. Cyber attack of our infrastructure. When I was in Congress, I represented the Port of Los Angeles, which, with the Port of Long Beach, is the largest container port complex in the country. 50% of our container traffic enters and exits through those ports. There are cranes on the port, surprise, to move the cargo, and those cranes have Chinese technology. So guess what?
All of which are subject to the possibilities of cyber attack.
Absolutely. We should anticipate that our ports could go down.
Throughout our entire society, we find that to be the case, don't we?
I'm agreeing with you. And this is devastating. Does the American public understand this? No. You also mentioned space. Again, something I know something about, since I used to call my district the aerospace center of the universe, where most of our intelligence satellites were made. We are more dependent on space as a country and more vulnerable in space because of that dependency than any other country. And shoring up space, which is one of the threats we address, is absolutely crucial. And it's not just military space, but commercial space. A lot of how you talked about communication, a lot of how we communicate is through commercial space. And think how inconvenienced the public would be if all of a sudden their little devices, which we're all dependent on, didn't work. The public is essentially clueless about the massive cyber attacks that could be launched any day by our adversaries, not just nation states, but rogue actors as well.
If we allow these people to drag us down this World War III path, our oceans will not protect us from this one. And neither, apparently, can our military. Here's Eric Edelman speaking to Senator Deb Fischer of Nebraska.
The force right now is too small, and so we have to grow the force, and that's in the face of the recruiting challenges that we've highlighted in the report that the Army in particular, but also the Navy and the Air Force have faced.
And why, and I'm going to interrupt you.
Please.
Why is it too small? Can you explain, in this setting, the threats that we are facing when we look at the adversaries that we face and how that has changed over the last decade?
It's too small in part because the department was sizing itself for one conflict. But if you have to be present in 3 theaters, as we are now, we've got conflicts in 2 theaters now. If we have a third conflict in a third theater, it's going to require a lot more forces. People talk, for instance, about the Indo-Pacific being largely a Navy and Air Force fight. That's correct, but the logistics that support the Navy and the Air Force will largely be manned by the Army. And so we have to have an Army that is sufficiently large that it can operate in all of these places potentially simultaneously. Because honestly, it is very hard to imagine today a conflict in the Indo-Pacific that doesn't become a global conflict very quickly. Someone asked earlier in the hearing about cooperation between Russia and China. The last time I testified before this committee was 2 years ago about the so-called three-body problem, Russia, China being both nuclear peers of the United States. And one of the criticisms that was leveled at my colleague Frank Miller and me was that, there's no evidence that Russia and China are collaborating in the nuclear area. Well, we just saw them flying strategic bombers together, up near Alaska. So, I don't know what more evidence you want that they're beginning to collaborate in that strategic area.
And after this hearing, which took place at the end of July, I'm recording this in the middle of August, it hasn't been that long. And in between that testimony and today, there was more evidence because the secretary of Russia's Security Council met with Iran's new president. And Iran has a new president because the last one recently died in a plane crash that, thank God, as of right now, we don't seem to have had anything to do with. But Iran has a brand new president. And this is the first time that such high-ranking leaders from Russia and Iran have met in person to discuss an acceleration of their military partnership. That was the purpose of the meeting, to accelerate their military partnership. And on top of that, they aren't just partnering militarily. We've already heard in this hearing how they are partnering economically to get around our sanctions, to get around our weapons of economic war that we have been using against Russia and Iran for quite a long time now. But they are also partnering in infrastructure. Because in an idea that was first agreed to in 2005, the two countries have recently recommitted to finishing a 4,500-mile transportation network with shipping lanes, rail lines, and roads that are being built to connect Russia and Iran and all the countries in between. Now, the delay, because, it's been almost 20 years, the delay has been caused in large part due to our sanctions, due to our economic wars against both of those countries. But as we learned in the Demise of Dollar Dominance episode, countries around the world are building financial networks outside of the one created by the United States and our World Trade System corporate partners. And Russia, Iran, and China are leading the way. That's what's at the heart of all of this. And at this point, it is simply undeniably true when you look at all of those different ways that they're coordinating, that the countries that label themselves the axis of resistance, as in resistance to us, they're partnering in so many different ways that this is definitely a challenge to the global order that these people that control our government want to keep intact. These experts in their international order are telling Congress that we are unprepared in the fight that they want to wage to maintain that order. We are unprepared to physically fight the axis of resistance if necessary. And so in the conversation that's happening in our Congress right now, they have openly turned to questioning the voluntary nature of service in the United States military. Here's Eric Edelman.
The DoD workforce and the all-volunteer force provide us with a kind of unmatched advantage, but recruiting failures have shrunk the force and have raised serious questions about the sustainability of the all-volunteer force in peacetime, let alone if we had to mobilize for a major conflict or a protracted conflict.
Now, there was some discussion about how to get more volunteers for the military, and here's some of that discussion from Jane Harmon.
One of the problems is the kind of deployments the military does, every 2 years moving somewhere, where in many cases the spouse works and having to change his or her job every 2 years is very burdensome. It's also hard on kids, and so that could change.
And yes, it would probably help if they made volunteering for the military suck less for families. And as the stepsister of a veteran who had to move often and to some pretty shitty places, I was happy to see that suggestion as part of the discussion. But I was disturbed that the discussion about why volunteering for this particular military can kind of suck, I was disturbed that they didn't mention the fact that many Americans don't want to be the bad guys. And that's really uncomfortable for me to say, because it's branded as unpatriotic to ever question the motivations of the United States. We are always the good guys, and to question that is treason. But the problem is I became an adult in the year 2000, and 1 year later was 9/11. And because we were unquestionably the good guys, I couldn't understand why anyone would attack us like that. It was a mystery to a lot of people. And I saw the entire world rally behind us. There was footage from people all over the world waving American flags. And when we declared war in Afghanistan in response to 9/11, I had no reason to question it, because we are the good guys. But then we invaded Iraq. And I experienced that invasion differently than most Americans, because I wasn't living in the United States when it happened. I was living in Germany, and I was watching different news programs every night. And from my vantage point in Germany, I knew before the invasion that some of the things that we were being told about Iraq were straight up lies. Specifically, after President George W. Bush told the world that Saddam Hussein, then the leader of Iraq, was trying to get uranium from Africa to build weapons of mass destruction. Well, he said that, and then there was a commercial break, and then the news came back on, and it was reported in Germany that there was intelligence out of Great Britain saying that that wasn't true. Now, this was in January of 2003, and the war didn't start for 2 more months. But it wasn't until 2006 that that lie became common knowledge inside of the United States. I was back in the United States by then, and I was shocked to find out that Americans were not told a lot about reality before we launched the Iraq War. And it was also around this time that we found out that we were kidnapping people off the streets in the Middle East and sending them to other countries where they could be tortured. And then we learned that our own soldiers were torturing people at Abu Ghraib prison. They even took pictures. And so for the first time, we clearly were not the good guys. And now it's happening again, but somehow, in a situation I never thought possible, it's even worse this time. Because we are helping Israel wipe Palestine off the map once and for all. Israel has been trying to wipe Palestine off the map for 75 years. But just like how the Bush administration used 9/11 to justify its carnage in Iraq, Israel is using the October 7th attacks to justify finishing the job in Palestine. The job being getting rid of Palestinians and stealing all of their land. Because the Israelis have now fully destroyed Gaza. It's undeniable. They are making it uninhabitable. And they are openly stealing land in the Palestinian West Bank. Just this week, they announced more giant pieces of land being seized by Israel where they intend to build condos exclusively for Israelis. The Israeli government's intentions are not being hidden, and their actions are even worse than what we did in Iraq. Because as shameful and horrible as the Iraq War was, when our invasion was over, Iraqi infrastructure still remained, a good chunk of it. There were still functional hospitals and sewer systems and water delivery systems and roads, and there was fuel for cars, and there was medicine, and most Iraqis still had homes. And there were also open borders, so if Iraqis wanted to leave, they could, and they did. And when we were caught torturing Iraqis, the American soldiers that tortured them were held accountable. Now, the higher-ups who ordered the torture were not, but we at least stopped the torture once it was exposed. But what we're participating in now, the people of Gaza have no hospitals left. They have no sewer systems. They have no infrastructure to deliver clean running water. And since no one is allowed in to count such things, we don't know how many homes are still standing, but just look at the pictures. Destroyed homes, whole towers are destroyed. And that kind of carnage is visible as far as the eye can see in pictures taken all over the Gaza Strip. The roads are also rubble, and forget fuel for cars. There's not enough fuel for bulldozers to get people whose screams can be heard who are trapped in the rubble. Countless humans, including children who could be saved, have had to simply suffer in darkness and pain until they die. On top of that, there's an active polio outbreak now, but the only people being given vaccines are Israeli soldiers. And no one who lives in Gaza is allowed to leave. And then there's the torture. Instead of holding anyone, even the low-level patsies, accountable, Israeli torture is being defended by Israeli government officials. This is a quote, an actual quote from Israeli Police Minister Itamar Ben-Gvir after the torture of the prisoners he's in charge of was internationally exposed. He said, quote, "Since assuming my role as police minister, one of my top priorities has been to worsen the conditions for terrorists in prisons and reduce their rights to the minimum required by law," unquote. This is so much worse than what we did in Iraq. But we are providing the weapons that make it possible. And we are using our diplomacy to stop other countries from intervening to stop it. And when the guy responsible for all of this, the Prime Minister of Israel, Benjamin Netanyahu, came to Congress because he was invited by the Republican Party, our Congress stood up and gave him standing ovations over 50 times. I am so ashamed of my government right now. So many of us are so ashamed of our foreign policy, and we have been ashamed for 25 years. And that shameful foreign policy does play a role in military recruitment. Because no one wants to fight and die as the bad guys. And we have too often in my lifetime been clearly the bad guys. But there was no discussion about a change in policy that would make fewer people around the world feel the need to resist us. There was no discussion about a change in policy that would make fewer people view us as the great Satan. There was no discussion about a change in policy that would take us in the opposite direction of being the bad guys. Instead, our hesitation to volunteer ourselves, or in the case of us elder millennials and older, volunteer our kids to fight for goals we don't support, was branded like this by Jane Harman.
The notion of public service isn't new, as you know, Mr. Chairman. It's been around for years. It was around when I served in Congress, and Congress did not act on any of the proposals that I saw. It is still a way to get all of the public at the proper age engaged in understanding the requirements of citizenship. A lot of our young people have no earthly idea, sadly, because they have no civic education, what our government really is and what are the ways to serve. And surely one of the most honorable ways to serve is as a member of the military. You did it, and other members of this committee have done this. And I think that is the way to revive a kind of sense of coherence and patriotism that we are lacking right now.
Our education. Maybe, just maybe, 9/11 and the Iraq War, hell, the Vietnam War before that, and torture and endless drone bombings and the extermination of Palestinians. Maybe that is our education. Maybe we know plenty about how all you f***s have twisted our government into representing you and your goals of global domination. Maybe our education is spot on, and maybe that's why we don't want to volunteer to serve you. Maybe our patriotism, our love of the United States, and our resentment of you turning us into the great Satan. Maybe our patriotism and our goal of wanting to live up to what we say we are and what makes us resist your plans to take us to World War III. Maybe our patriotism is real. Because you're trying to get us to sign up our kids to fight and die. For what? For what? It's not to protect the United States. It seems to me that it's to make it so that shareholders can profit from Ukraine's fossil fuel and agricultural resources, or so that China can't run their economy and partner with other countries as they see fit. It also seems that we're fighting to ensure that Israel can continue to violently seize Middle East land with no repercussions from those who don't agree with the Israeli version of religious superiority. Perhaps we're not the ones lacking patriotism. Perhaps rich, selfish, arrogant monsters like Jane Harman and Eric Edelman and most of Congress and all of our recent presidents, perhaps their takeover our government and sacrificing our lives for their immoral goals, perhaps they're the ones who need a lesson in patriotism. These people are reckless with our lives. I debated talking about this today, but I think I'm going to. Because I haven't talked about it much, but I know for a fact that he wouldn't mind if I told you. But one of my best friends served in Iraq. He served twice. And he signed up after I had gotten back from Germany. I was so furious with him. Because I knew, because of what I learned in Germany, that that war was based on lies. And by that time, there was a bunch of people that had already died. But he signed up to fight because he wanted to defend this country. He also needed a job. But he's someone who wants to help people. He's dedicated his whole life, in even his career after the military, to helping people. But he did serve 2 tours in Iraq. And so I know how it is possible to despise the war and to not support its goals, but to support the troops. Because that's what I literally did. I support him then and I support him now. And we got lucky that he came home. But there were others who didn't. I grew up down the street from a cutie pie named Mark Daly. He was 1 year younger than me. But he looked just like Josh Hartnett, a little hottie. But when we were younger, his neighborhood was one neighborhood over. And we used to play street hockey every day. And so he would come over and play street hockey. And he also lived next door to my mom's best friend. And so when I was over at that house, I would play with the Daly kids. And Mark was sweet and kind and honestly kind of gentle. He was a great kid. No one disliked Mark Daly. And after 9/11, he signed up for the military. In fact, it was after the Iraq War started. He signed up for the military. And he wrote a post on MySpace explaining why he signed up. And he in no uncertain terms thought that we were the good guys. And so even though he had his reservations about the war itself, he wanted to help. He saw us as the good guys trying to help the Iraqis. But Mark came home in a box. And now the soccer field where I used to practice AYSO soccer as a kid across the street from my first high school, it's now named after Mark Daly. There's a big hole in our community. He was a great kid from a great family. And they were reckless with his life. And they were reckless with my best friend's life. And I think that's why I get so upset about these things. Because I don't think this is about protecting the United States homeland. Not when you look at what we're fighting for right now. The borders of Ukraine, trying to control Ukraine. And we've been following this Ukraine thing since 2014. We know this is about fossil fuels and agriculture and a battle for which countries are going to sign up for the World Trade System and which countries are signing up with, Russia, India, China, Brazil, the BRICS countries. This is about a battle of economic systems. And then this Israel thing, it's hard to defend. I can't defend it. And they're calling me unpatriotic because I thought that our country was about democracy, defending people's rights. We were about equality, or at least those were the ideals that we aspired to and that we were going to enforce around the world. But what's happening in Gaza, there's no way that you can say that this is about equality. We're assisting in a 75-year-long land grab. And But no matter how much one was needed, no one in this hearing, in that empty room in Congress, no one got a lesson in patriotism during this hearing. No one made the arguments that I just made for why there isn't a long line of young people itching to risk their lives for the goals of these people who so recklessly have recently put our soldiers' lives at risk, who have recently killed people that I know. Instead, they discussed how to get more soldiers, more Mark Dalys, even if they didn't want to volunteer. Here's Eric Edelman looking into his disturbing crystal ball.
If we got into some kind of conflict in the Indo-Pacific, whether it be over Taiwan or the South China Sea or East China Sea, what might Russia do? One thing that comes to mind is take advantage of the separatist movement in Moldova to move on Moldova, a country that's trying to move closer to the European Union and to the West, which would then precipitate additional conflict in Europe, or take advantage of the ethnic Russian-speaking minorities in the Baltic states, say Latvia, to initiate a conflict there. How would we manage that? When you raise that question with department leaders, they basically say, well, that, to go back to the chairman's point earlier, well, that would be sort of like World War II, or would require national mobilization. And that's correct, but we haven't really taken the next steps to really focus on what that and what a protracted conflict would actually look like. We're optimized to fight very short wars.
National mobilization. You know what that means in our vocabulary? That means the draft. That means bringing back the draft. That means signing you and or your kids up to fight for them, whether you or your kids want to fight or not. The 118th Congress, in an election year, is openly discussing bringing back the draft, which you don't know because the room was empty and the so-called reporters in D.C. are too busy covering every dumb fucking thing that is said in the presidential campaign. Coconut, brat, couch fucker, tampon Tim, weird. I don't even have to speak in full sentences, and you know at least one of those references because those are the stories that are everywhere. But an open discussion in the United States Senate about the real possibility of World War III and possibly bringing back the draft? This should be national news. Here's Eric Edelman.
We have not really, as a society, talked about the need for national mobilization. But if the worst were to happen, and some of the worst scenarios we discuss in our report were to come to pass, and were we to face a global conflict, it would require mobilization on the scale of what we did as a nation during World War II. And we haven't done that in a long time. We haven't thought about that in a long time. There are a lot of elements to it, including stockpiling strategic materials, but being able to rapidly bring people into the military, et cetera. And I just don't think we're prepared to do it. I think we have to have a national discussion about this. And I think it goes hand in hand with the earlier discussion you had with my colleague about public service and serving the nation.
And the immediate reaction to this from our senators, the people we have elected to represent us? Well, here's an example from Jack Reed of Rhode Island.
We had in World War II 2 years, essentially from September 1st, 1939 to December 7th, 41, to prepare. And I doubt it will have 2 years to prepare in this environment.
The conversation wasn't about if a draft will be necessary, but how fast they'd have to do it. And so since Congress is now at the point of openly discussing a mandatory draft in preparation for World War III, I looked into the National Defense Authorization Act that they're writing right now to authorize our war activities for next year. Now, this bill, the NDAA, becomes law every single year without fail. It's usually signed into law in December around the holidays. And where it stands right now is that one version has already passed the House of Representatives and a different version has already passed the Senate. And so Congress is going to spend the rest of the year merging their two versions. But I want to be crystal clear that nothing I'm about to tell you is law yet. But there are provisions making their way towards law in both versions of the NDAA that take steps towards drafting American kids to fight in a war against their will. And so, currently, the way registering for the draft works is that all men between the ages of 18 and 26 are required to register for the draft, which is actually called the Selective Service. And if they don't register for the Selective Service, they're subject to a fine of up to $250,000 and or 5 years in prison. But currently, 46 states already have laws that automatically register men for the Selective Service when they get themselves a driver's license or they apply to go to college. But in 2020, a federal district court judge ruled that the current registration process is unconstitutional because it requires only men and not women to register to possibly be forced to fight and die for the elites in a war, which is discrimination on the basis of sex. And then the court essentially said that Congress needs to decide what to do about it. And here, Congress does have a few options. One obvious option is that Congress could get rid of the Selective Service. They could get rid of the draft process and change their policies so that we prioritize cooperation with other countries, as opposed to generating fear of our military dominance and our willingness to use it. But that option wasn't discussed in the hearing. Instead, this is the solution being kicked around. Here's Senator Joe Manchin of West Virginia speaking to Jane Harmon.
Second, I would say that on your report, you talked about the current force structure that we have, and I think you had identified that the Marines are the only ones meeting that, and we agree with that. What you failed to do is basically identify why we have not, or why you all did not take up women being in selective service or joining selective service, because women make up 74% healthcare and education industry, 52% of financial activities. They're a tremendously strong force, and there's a lot of women I don't want to go up against, I can tell you that, in so many ways. But why do you believe, I guess my question is simple, does the Commission support women registering for selective service?
Well, I'll speak for myself. I do. I think that women are a majority of our population, a majority of the talent pool. Many of the most talented women serve on this committee. So yes, they should be. We should be. And
I'll make it clear that it does not. We talked about does not require women to participate in military draft.
I understand.
Which also require.
It's registering.
Yeah, registering.
Yes,
that's all.
And my answer to that is yes.
And the Senate is apparently listening to Jane Harmon. Because if it were to become law, Section 598A of the Senate NDAA would require, quote, every citizen of the United States and every other person residing in the United States between the ages of 18 and 26 shall be automatically registered by the Selective Service System, unquote, within 30 days of their 18th birthday. And only some people with, quote, lawful non-immigrant status, unquote, whatever that means, will be exempt from registering for our draft. But every citizen of the United States, that includes women. But there is one provision in the Senate NDAA that might make you feel a bit better about your sweet little girl possibly getting drafted to fight in World War III. Because Section 529B of the Senate NDAA says that if women are required to register for the Selective Service, if women are required to register to be drafted, women then couldn't be forced to join combat roles that they were prohibited from serving in before 2016, which is when the Department of Defense policies were changed to allow women to serve in infantry, artillery, armor, combat engineering, and special operations units of battalion size or smaller. And so if that provision survives, along with the automatic registration of all of our kids, women couldn't be forced to serve in those combat positions, but could volunteer for them if they wanted to. And I've included the Senate NDAA in the show notes in case you want to see this for yourself or share it and communicate your thoughts with your members of Congress accordingly. Now, looking at the House NDAA, that has some provisions related to the draft, but they're different. And so in the House, Section 531 of the House NDAA also requires automatic registration for the Selective Service, but only for all males present in the United States, including non-citizens, between the ages of 18 and 26. And so the House keeps the system that has already been ruled to be unconstitutional, but just makes it automatic, which is the kind of stupidity that I've come to expect from this particular House of Representatives. But the point is that your current Congress, in an election year, is openly discussing bringing back the draft during a congressional hearing and is putting language in bills right now to prepare to do so. And I bet you haven't heard a damn thing about this. Until now, of course. And so if you have thoughts now, right now, is the time to communicate them to your members of Congress before any of this becomes law. And perhaps you should also give this information to members of the media who are too busy with presidential election gossip to notice the congressional preparations for World War III. But while we wait to learn the fate of these provisions in the final version of the 2025 NDAA, this is another step towards manufacturing consent for World War III that I think we can expect them to start enacting pretty much immediately, and you should be ready for it. Here's Jane Harmon.
Sadly, we think, and I'm sure you agree, that the public has no idea how great the threats are and is not mobilized to meet them. Public support is critical to implement the changes we need to make. Leaders on both sides of the aisle and across government need to make the case to the public and get their support.
It's propaganda time. Time to scare the shit out of the American people. And for an idea of what messages they're likely to push out to their obedient stenographers in the DC corporate press, here's Jane Harmon again.
And the word pivot probably should be retired. I don't think we can leave anywhere. I think we have to have an understanding of the threats against us, not just against regions, everywhere. And the whole idea of this multiple force construct is flexibility and having an adequate deterrence so we don't engage in more wars.
And here's how they plan to be everywhere.
First finding, DOD cannot and should not provide for the national defense by itself. The NDS calls for an integrated deterrence that is not reflected in practice today. A truly all elements of national power approach is required to coordinate and leverage resources across DOD, the rest of the executive branch, the private sector, civil society, and U.S. allies and partners. We agree with the NDS on the importance of allies, and we commend the administration for expanding and strengthening NATO and building up relationships and capabilities across Asia. We also point out ways for the United States to be better partners ourselves, including by maintaining a more stable presence globally and in key organizations like NATO. We call for reducing barriers to intelligence sharing, joint production, and military exports so we can better support and prepare to fight with our closest allies.
And one of the ways that the arrogant elites like Jane Harmon, who have control of our government, and their partners around the world plan to deter anyone from resisting them is, here's Eric Edelman.
Nuclear deterrence, Senator Fisher, is is the fundament on which everything else is built. in terms of our national security. It's operating every day. It's not visible to, American citizens, but the fact of our nuclear deterrent force, all three legs of the triad, being available is the most powerful deterrent that we have to conflict. It's not sufficient, but it is the absolute basis. And we really, I think, agreed with the conclusion our colleagues on the Strategic Posture Commission reached, which is that we have to move forward with alacrity on all the elements of modernization of the nuclear triad. That's the GBSD Sentinel program, that is the B-21, that is the Ohio replacement class. All of those things have to be accomplished, and there are problems in some. One of the reasons we highlighted education is that some of the problems that GBSD are running into has to do with lack of skilled workers to be able to pour the kind of special reinforced concrete that you need for the new silos for missiles, the new control systems for missiles. We lack welders in the submarine industrial base, as Senator Wicker knows well. So there's a lot that has to be done across the board in order to move forward with nuclear modernization, but it is absolutely fundamental to our ability to deter aggression against our allies and, of course, against the homeland.
These people are so dangerous. They could get literally all of us killed. And again, for what? For their global dominance. Not ours. American citizens, the vast majority of us who are not power-hungry psychos, we're not the ones who benefit from the global dominance of our military. Multinational corporations and their shareholders, who siphon money into their own pockets from every purchase, are the ones who ultimately prosper from the international order that protects corporate resources and transportation. That's not about us. That's about them. Their money is the source of their power, and their power is used to ensure the continued supply of their unearned wealth. And no one is a more perfect example of this immoral cycle of wealth and war than Jane Harman. Because get this, from May 2015 until May of this year, 2024, so while she was creating this report for Congress, Jane Harman was paid about $180,000 per year to be on the board of directors of Iridium Communications, a tech company that specializes in global satellite communications and that definitely, according to its website, does business with governments and militaries, including our own. Specifically, Iridium Communications currently has a multi-year contract with the U.S. Space Force. Remember her whole rant about how important communications in space is? Yeah, the company that she was on the board of has a multi-year contract with the U.S. Space Force. But the website also says that this company has been working with the Department of Defense for 20 years, since around the time when Jane Harman was a member of Congress. Put another way, while working on this report for Congress, Jane Harman was a board member at a multinational corporation that specializes in war-related tech. And this is what she told Congress just 2 months after leaving the board of directors.
Second recommendation is fundamental shifts in threats and technology require fundamental change in how DoD functions. This is particularly true of how DoD works with the tech sector, where most of our innovation happens. We say that DoD is operating at the speed of bureaucracy when the threat is approaching wartime urgency. DoD's structure is optimized for research and development for exquisite, irreplaceable platforms when the future is autonomy, AI, and large numbers of cheaper and attritable systems. I know this because I represented the Aerospace Center of Los Angeles in Congress for so many years, where exquisite, irreplaceable satellite platforms were built. And now we know that there is a plethora of commercial platforms that can do many of the same things and offer redundancy. DoD programs like Replicator and the Defense Innovation Unit and the Office of Strategic Capital are great, but they're essentially efforts to work around the larger Pentagon system.
Notice how she didn't mention that she was on the board of directors at a company that would profit from her suggestion that the Pentagon use more of our money to buy commercial tech products in space? And she had even more to say about the purchasing process of the equipment that she personally profited from, and probably still profits from as a shareholder. Which I say because I know she recently had a lot of Iridium Communications stock because she sold over 100 grand worth of it in March and stuffed that cash into her pocket. And at that time, it was reported on wallmine.com that she still owned 60,516 shares, which equals over $1.6 million worth of the stock today. And so with that in mind, here's her not at all impartial ideas shared with Senator Angus King of Alaska during the hearing.
But I think that Congress is somewhat complicit in the way the budget process doesn't work and this insistence on requirements and oversight rather than on what is the problem set we are solving for, which is how the tech sector thinks. I've been making a comment about DIU, the Defense Innovation Unit that was set up by the late Secretary Ash Carter, that maybe we should outsource the Pentagon to DIU, which is ably headed by someone named Doug Beck, who had 11 years' experience in the private sector, because they know how to think about this. And I couldn't agree with you more. The budget of DIU is $1 billion out of $850 billion. Doug Beck says he can leverage
and it's
that.
technologies that win wars.
Right. I'm in violent agreement with you. He says he can leverage that into $50 billion of commercial investment, but that's still a pittance compared to the kind of change we need to undergo, not just at the Pentagon, but at the Pentagon lashed up with other government agencies, with the tech sector, and with partners and allies. That is our point about all elements of national power, which will win the next war.
These people can't be trusted. She never in this hearing shared with the senators her clear conflict of interest. She never told them that, oh, by the way, if you reduce oversight and outsource the Pentagon and spend billions in tax money on commercial tech products, my $1.6 million in stock could skyrocket. She also didn't tell them that she was on that board of directors the entire time she was writing this report. None of that was disclosed. And so I can't help but be furious when she simultaneously suggests spending tens of billions of our money.
Additionally, we think that Congress should revoke the 2023 spending caps and provide real growth. I know Senator Wicker loves this one. For fiscal year 2025 defense and non-defense national security spending that, at a bare minimum, falls within the range recommended by the 2018 NDS Commission. That range was never achieved. Subsequent budgets will require spending that puts defense and other components of national security, other components jointly across government and the tech sector and partners and allies, other components on a glide path to support efforts commensurate with the U.S. national efforts seen during the Cold War.
And then she advises Congress that this is how they should pay for it.
We agree on a unanimous basis that the national debt is its own national security challenge. If we want to approach Cold War levels of spending, we need to increase resources and reform entitlement spending.
How about someone in Congress question if we want to approach Cold War levels of spending on war? That questioning never happened. Instead, Congress is considering taxing us more and giving us less return in direct benefits. Because in their vocabulary, entitlement means retirement money and health care. They're saying you should be taxed more and you should get less in retirement and health care, as if either of those things were well taken care of here in the United States for the average American. And none of your senators disagreed with that assessment. This is the path they envision for us if we continue to empower these people. And no one is telling you this, that you will be taxed more, that you will have less money in retirement, that you will pay more for healthcare out of pocket, and that you and your child could be drafted to die. Also that they can dominate the global financial system. They being the shareholder class, the parasites who do no work, but because they have money can buy shares, which then means they get a cut of every purchase we make from a multinational corporation. They being the Republican and Democratic Party elites, who have so thoroughly rigged our electoral system that almost no one outside of their war-loving duopoly has a reasonable chance of gaining real power. They are the ones who are empowered in their international order, a term that I'm also understanding differently than I have in the past lately, especially since last fall. Because I always assumed that the United Nations was the meeting place of the international order, because that was the idea after World War II, or at least that's what they said the idea was anyway. But after watching the United Nations be so thoroughly ignored in these last 10 months as they repeatedly find that Israel is flagrantly violating international law in Gaza and the West Bank, and after learning that the United Nations has found Israel's land grabs illegal over and over again for decades, but the land grabs never stopping and in fact ramping up to this current level, which is beyond anything I could have imagined, I'm not seeing the United Nations at the center of international power, at the center of international order. It just isn't. And I don't actually think the World Trade Organization is either, although I do think it's closer. But I think that the international order is a big club, and you ain't in it. It's people like Jane Harman, who even when no longer elected are still calling the shots. It's people like Victoria Nuland and her awful husband Robert Kagan, who have been elected to nothing and yet have the blood of millions on their hands. It's people who have been elected, like Nancy Pelosi, who think buying and selling stock is the same as participating in the economy, as if the stock market is the economy. I can't name them all, and I don't know how to identify them. But all I know is that I'm not one of them, and you probably aren't either. I know that allowing them to continue to control our country will continue to make this country unrecognizable to the child version of me, who was taught that the United States stood for democracy and equality, life, liberty, and the pursuit of happiness for everyone. I thought we were the good guys, and I think that most of us really want to be. But they have turned us into something else. And they are seeing the axis of resistance growing and threatening their dominance. And they want us to fight for them. And many of us don't want to. And so they're talking about forcing us to. They are the bad guys. And they are endangering the whole world. Not just Palestinians and Russians and Ukrainians. Again, let's not forget that that war was launched in 2014, when then Vice President Joe Biden and his partners helped midwife a coup in Ukraine after Ukraine dared to economically partner with their next-door neighbor, Russia. We've been watching this since 2014. That's when the seeds of that war were planted, which was, like World War III, totally ignored by the corporate press at the time. We are being governed by dangerous and increasingly desperate people. Desperate to maintain control of their power and their ability to accumulate infinite amounts of wealth that requires no work. And I'm just curious how long we're going to let this continue. Are we really going to let apathy walk us right into a military draft? Walk us right into World War III? The way our apathy has made us complicit in a quote-unquote plausible genocide as it was recently ruled by the International Court of Justice? I don't have a good feeling about any of this. I've watched a lot of hearings, a lot of them about war. I've never heard them talk about bringing back the draft like this. And I don't know what to do about it, except for to tell you that this conversation is happening right now in your Congress with very little press coverage, and hope that you'll share this information. Because we can't do anything about war preparations that we aren't aware of. And so I guess that has to be the first step, right? Is to tell everyone. And hopefully, after awareness is raised, we can identify and disempower the international order of the shareholder club from there. That's all I can think of to do. So I have some news that is incomplete, and it's not good. But I feel the need to give you a heads up because as a producer of Congressional Dish, if you are supporting the show on Patreon, Patreon is about to make some major changes that I think could really screw with us. Or maybe not. Like I said, I don't really know yet. But I need to give you this heads up because the only reason that I ever signed up to have a Patreon account in the first place is because Patreon was offering us something that no other payment processing service was, which is they allowed us to pay for this show per episode. Because when I started the show, there were plenty of people paying monthly on PayPal. You can also pay monthly or weekly or biweekly, whatever you want, via paper checks. We had Zells. We had so many options that allow you to pay monthly. But Patreon is special with the per episode option. And so that's what our Patreon has been. And we have over 1,000 people who are paying per episode on Patreon and like it that way. But Patreon just sent out something to all of us, basically a blog post. It's actually public. If you want to see it, I put it in the show notes, where they announced that because of Apple, who wants basically a 30% cut of my money in order to have Patreon in the App Store, because of Apple's demands, Patreon is getting rid of the per episode payment method that we have counted on them for many years. And so there's one thing I can tell you for sure, which is that nothing is changing until November of this year. So you don't have to really worry about this right now. But there is also going to be some kind of grandfathering in of people who are paying per episode. And so basically what I'm saying is, if you want to pay for the show per episode, I can't guarantee that we'll be able to do this long term. But if that's something that you want, sign up for our Patreon now, and do not do it through the Apple app. Even though they're not charging us right now, just fuck Apple so hard, because they want to take it. Like, they want to take 30% of the money that you pay me every single month to produce this show, just because you signed up through their app. And so if you sign up on patreon.com on the computer or through anything in the Android ecosystem, you don't have to pay that 30% rent to Apple. It's absolutely absurd. But what I'm struggling to understand is why Patreon needs to change their whole business model to serve Apple. So my co-host on We're Not Wrong, Justin Robert Young, tends to think that this is bullshit, that they're using Apple as an excuse to get rid of something they've wanted to get rid of, but I have no proof that that's true. And actually, we're going to be having this discussion on We're Not Wrong. So we're doing a live show on August 18th in Chicago. The tickets are available on Justin Robert Young's Twitter page. But we're going to be doing a live show, and it'll be myself, Andrew Heaton, Justin Robert Young, all three of us who depend on Patreon to make a living. And our special guest is going to be Tom Merritt of the Daily Tech News Show. And he could not be more perfect for this discussion, because I don't know anyone in the universe that knows more about tech companies and how they think and what they do than Tom Merritt. And so we are going to be talking about this. We usually don't tell you what our topics are ahead of time because, quite frankly, we don't know. But for this one, we've already decided that that's going to be one of our discussions. And so I will know a lot more about this after I finish this episode and study up for that episode. But for right now, if I'm giving you any kind of action plan, the one thing that I want to make sure you understand is that if you like the per episode idea of paying for Congressional Dish, go and start your Patreon now, because that's the only way to get grandfathered in if they're going to allow that. So that's annoying, and that will be obviously something I keep you updated on, not only what their rules are going to be, but also what I'm going to do about it. Because right now, I can tell you, I just cried when I found out about this. I'm still pretty upset about it because it's a pretty big deal for us. And also, it's just kind of a rough week. We have no executive producers to announce. I don't know what's going on with the funding for this show, but I'm hoping some funding comes in for this episode, since I think this topic's pretty fucking important. So yeah, please pay for the show if you're not doing it already. And hopefully this Patreon thing doesn't destroy my income, but we will see. Speaking of income, I also want to give you a quick heads up about a very important news organization that I know I count on and is actually a part of the Congressional Dish origin story, and that is C-SPAN. Because C-SPAN, they're not in any danger of going away, so I'm not going to be a Cassandra about it. But what people don't seem to understand about C-SPAN is that C-SPAN and the amazing archive of congressional footage that they have collected since, I think, 1979, that archive has been paid for by cable companies. But many of us, myself included, have cut the cord and are getting our television a different way if we are even paying for live television at all. So for instance, I'm using YouTube TV for my television, for my live television, and they refuse to pay C-SPAN the 6 cents that C-SPAN would like in order to offer C-SPAN to the YouTube TV people. So, I mean, if you have YouTube TV, maybe send them a comment, be like, yo, why don't you have C-SPAN? Because it's literally the cheapest thing you can put on there and it's a public service. So that's infuriating. But the cable companies are the ones paying for it. And where the cable companies are making less money, it does threaten C-SPAN's business model. And so as you may know, I've become friends with some of the people at C-SPAN. They are the best people with the best mission. I trust C-SPAN in these people's hands. And they're trying to figure out how to keep it going, how to keep it alive, how to keep it alive. And so one of the things that they're trying is a fundraiser. And so right now they're running a fundraiser. It goes until August 31st. And so, clock is ticking. But what's exciting about this fundraiser is an anonymous rich donor is going to match the funds that C-SPAN raises up to $25,000. The problem is, as of this recording in mid-August, the fundraiser has only raised about half of that money. And so we're just leaving money on the table. If you donate to C-SPAN right now, it gets doubled by a rich dude. And so I have donated. And so I'm just putting this on your radar in case you would also like to help C-SPAN. Because like I said, I wouldn't have started this if I didn't have C-SPAN just on TV one day. And I haven't told this story for a minute, so let me tell you the C-SPAN origin story. Because back in, I believe it was 2011, I was working one of my odd jobs. I had quite a few lost years when I didn't know what to do with myself. And so one of the jobs that I had to just pay my bills was a lovely job where I set up photo booths for corporate events, holidays, but mostly weddings. And so I would load the booth up from the office. I would put it in my Volkswagen Bug and I would go to the event and set up the booth. And then I would change my clothes to not look like trash. And then I would man the booth during the event. And I love that during weddings because I got to make a scrapbook for the bride and groom with all the pictures of their friends and family. It was really fun. I loved that job. But that meant that I had a lot of free time, especially during the day. And so on one particular day, we had been watching a friend's dog, which just shed all over our apartment. So I was cleaning up dog hair. And so I just put on C-SPAN in the background because as I was just clicking through channels with nothing on in the middle of the day, I saw that the House of Representatives was debating an energy and water funding bill. And at the time, my husband, who is still a solar power engineer, but this is when he was, a guppy in that pond, and the Massachusetts state tax credits, which were really funding his business at the time, were about to run out. And so we were looking at the federal situation just to kind of try to read the tea leaves to figure out if he gets laid off, what would be our next move. And sure enough, he did get laid off, and that's how we ended up having to go west. But anyway, I wanted to see what was going on with the federal tax credits. And so I just stopped my scrolling on C-SPAN. And so as I'm listening to this, a member of the House of Representatives, who is actually now in a leadership position in the House of Representatives over a decade later, his name is Tom Cole. He's a representative from Oklahoma. Tom Cole got up there and bragged about getting an amendment inserted into this energy and water bill that would protect secret campaign contributions. And two things went through my head. One was, how is it that that's possible? And two, why would you brag about that? And so after seeing that, was like, well, this is obviously a scandal. And so that night I tuned into the news. I figured, Rachel Maddow, she's definitely going to want to talk about this. But she didn't. Neither did Wolf Blitzer or, of course, anyone on Fox News. And so then I went to the internet. And this was the big light bulb moment for me, because not even on the internet, there was no articles, there was no blog posts, there was nothing. It was like this never even happened. And yet this asshole is out there bragging about what he did. And so it occurred to me, maybe he's able to brag about that. Maybe he's able to brag about that publicly to his donors and not fear the American people because no one's paying attention. And so I looked for only the second time in my life into the congressional record to see, did that amendment actually make it into the bill, which it did. And then I started wondering, how often does this happen? Which is when I started looking into the congressional record more often, realizing that this happens all the time and deciding that maybe this is some way I could be useful to society, is to read the congressional record and to tell people these dirty secrets that I'm finding. And so for the first 2 years of Congressional Dish, I read every bill that passed the House of Representatives, a task that I now know to be completely impossible, but I did do it. This show has just been evolving ever since, but that never would have happened if C-SPAN just wasn't on the TV. And so I will always be grateful to C-SPAN. And so if you are also grateful to C-SPAN, let's help them out with this fundraiser. They only need like 10 grand more. And so collectively we can help them. And if you want to, you could also mention Congressional Dish in the donation comments, because let's be real, the C-SPAN lovers are our target audience. And so I would certainly appreciate your efforts as the Congressional Dish advertising if you're going to do that. But yeah, Justin and I are on a mission to show C-SPAN that if you ask us, people will support you, because that's how we've built our entire business model. And we're proud of it. And even though there's definitely challenges to it, like when the payment processing company that you've been counting on for years makes changes that could quite literally destroy your business. Yeah, lots of anxiety about that. But the fact that we have individuals supporting us and the freedom that we have to create the businesses that we want to create, to say the things we want to say. Like, what's beautiful about C-SPAN is that they don't have to bend to any corporate advertisers, and neither do I, and neither does Justin or Andrew. Like, our freedom is tied to this business model. And so we're trying to prove to the C-SPAN execs that they can do it too. So help prove us right. All right. That's about it for today. If you want to follow me specifically on Instagram, I am heading this weekend to the Democratic National Convention. And like I said, we're starting the week off with our We're Not Wrong live show on Sunday night, and then I will spend the rest of the week at the DNC. I have 5 interviews already done with Republican members of Congress, and I'm going to try and interview more Democratic members of Congress, and we'll just see how that goes. I still feel like it's not real life when I'm in these rooms with these people. I just don't feel like I belong with them, but since I got the access, I might as well use it, right? So yeah, I'm just trying to learn how these Congress people think and how Congress functions and all that. So I'm doing interviews, but if you have any questions that you would like me to ask about, like the episode I'm working on, or at least I was working on with the Republicans, was asking about the functions of Congress. I kind of wanted to stay away from the politics. And even though I was trying to stay away from politics, there were members of Congress that were just like, well, you know, if our party was in charge, everything would be different. And I'm like, okay, asshole, I've been doing this for 13 years, and I've seen the same behavior with both of you parties, and which obviously I didn't say to their faces, but the partisanship, it just sneaks in even when you're trying to avoid it. If you have any questions that you think might be interesting, if you got a chance to interview a member of Congress, I am curious about hearing them, because I don't know what I'm doing. This is my first time. So yeah. So follow me on Instagram, and I will be posting all my updates. Pretty sure I'll be back in the C-SPAN booth, which is very exciting. So yeah, here we go again. All right. Thanks for listening to Congressional Dish. Please support Congressional Dish. You can find all the options on the Support the Show page on congressionaldish.com. And next episode should be something from the DNC. All right. Love you. Talk to you later. Bye.
We're surrounded now by liars coming at us through our TV screens.
We don't have a domestic spying program.
They're content to fight in black and white despite of any in-betweens. We got a president who plays with the facts. And then he waves a flag to cover his tracks. As if a lie is alright, if the end will justify the means. Now we are so damn tired of being lied to.
The polar ice caps aren't going away.
We don't think we can deny it anymore. You can stick to your story if you think it flies.
government jobs consume the profits of the private sector.
We don't think we can deny it anymore. You can't stick to your story if you think it flies. But we're not keeping quiet anymore. Now we're not keeping quiet.
These bills represent common sense, bipartisan solutions that actually solve problems.